The impact of abandonment, specifically parental abandonment, cannot be overstated. And as someone who sits here today on Father's Day, and I was realizing this morning that about 33 years ago, on Father's Day essentially, my father, who at the time I believed was my biological father, the man who my parents had been, split since I was 2 and had been an intermittent Disneyland, highly eggshell dad, the greatest guy in the room, one of the hardest guys to live with, drove himself to an emergency room parking lot on Father's Day essentially and ended his time here. I had been living in fear he would do that most of my life, and I was only 23 years old. And we had been estranged for about 5 years because his behavior had become really, really quite damaging. And I didn't know the words of estrangement around 18. I just was like, I just can't do this anymore. But about 4 months before he decided to make that decision, we had 2 phone calls, and they were really beautiful phone calls. And it just happened to be that on Father's Day, I was essentially, this is so crazy, fleeing my childhood home with my mother in Texas, where we had lived for the same house for about 15 years. As about a month prior, she had decided to file for divorce against my stepfather, like I'm saying, after 15 years of marriage. And he had essentially, alongside her not making some great decisions, made it to where we were losing our house. And I had come back from college thinking I was just going to come back from Maryland, hit Dallas, and go on to California. My mom was in crisis. And as what would become a lifelong pattern, I rescued her and became the parent. And that part, feels bad for her. But the point is, I was on the road. We were driving from Dallas to California, really in a kind of our own crisis situation, when I got the news in a hotel room in San Diego that my father had done that. And I basically lost my father and my stepdad at the same time. Never saw or spoke to my stepfather again because of the things he had done with my mom. And so when I say I have daddy issues, I'm smiling because it's like, once again, an understatement. And I spend so much time in my content here, though I do have a lot of videos around father wounds, and I certainly have them. And they certainly got reenacted in my marriage and divorce and my partner choosing. I talk so much about my mom because the research is really clear that the primary caregiver has the most impact on us. And in most cases, it is mothers. But it seems to be that when we talk about abandonment, when we say that word, I think we're often thinking about what's historically been fathers leaving the home. And once again, regardless of moms who struggle, historically, it tends to be, at least in heterosexual relationships, that fathers, way more often than mothers, at least physically abandon the family. And I'm saying at least because we know that abandonment is so much more than physical. So we're going to talk about that today on Father's Day. And this video is going to cover a little bit of research. It's going to talk about kind of what it does to us, parental abandonment. We're going to talk about what to do. And I'm going to wrap up this video talking about if you are a father and you would like some ideas on how to be more involved and more of a positive figure in your child's life. We're going to talk about those things, and I'd like to make some suggestions. So if you're new here, I'm a licensed clinical psychologist, obviously with my own package of wounding, although the truth is, I am 56 years old. I have been dealing with these issues for a lot of years. And there's no doubt that psychology has helped me, and I have been in therapy for a very long time. So when I talk about this concept today, I feel a bit distanced from it. Like I kind of forgot it was even Father's Day, to be honest. And it is Father's Day morning. I would have made this content even earlier. For my kids, I remind them, I know it's coming, but I don't really feel that like I did in probably the first 15 years. Clearly that he made that decision on Father's Day has never been a great day for me, but where I sit today, it doesn't impact me the way that it used to, though clearly it has been impactful. All right, so let's get into it. So the first question is, does it matter, parental abandonment, mothers versus fathers. And like I just said, the core research says what matters most is the primary caregiver, but that does not take away the wound. There's often a wound for the father or mother in this role if the parent is abandoning us, the one we wish we'd had, the one that we long for, right? Or the little parts that we did get that we wish could have stuck around or been better. But there are some things that research talks about in terms of the impact of absent and abandoning fathers, and it is significant. And so I don't want to minimize and say that, but it does matter if you've had at least one safely attached caregiver, ideally two or more, or a village in the best case scenario. But most of us today are lucky if we have one stable, emotionally safe parent. That's just the reality. And that can vary on how much safety we're talking about. But we do know that when fathers are present, that they bring a lot of advantages, and that when they're not present, things like dropout rates, how kids perform in school, impulsivity and risk-taking, especially around intimacy, even things around when a female child might have their experience of puberty change, things around identity and who we are, that when fathers show up with safe, kind of loving boundaries, that serves a purpose. We talk a lot about, even in my therapy, in a very kind of psychoanalytic way, about masculine and feminine energy. So this can be in anyone, but that ideally, sometimes, like for me, I've been so overly connected to my feminine mother with my kids, being the solo parent with pretty much full custody, and having to try to lean into the father part meant, in psychology terms, with at least my therapy, setting more boundaries, being able to tolerate their anger, things like that, like creating containment in a different way than as a mother. So that's just true that we see increased mental illness, risk-taking, violence in children, and imprisonment, all kinds of things. And so it is really important for both parents or multiple parents or whatever your format looks like, the more love and safety kids receive, the better. That is the ideal scenario. And I've talked about this a lot, but when I think about myself, and I made a video about this, I think a couple years ago, that I see myself in some regards as nobody's girl, as having two truly eggshell parents, and a father that clearly struggled and suffered, I will say, with significant trauma in his childhood. I do believe he did have borderline and major depression and maybe even bipolar, which would line up with kind of how his life played out. And the last thing I'll say, if you're new here, is that in my mid 40s, I believe I was 45, my mom told me that the man that did, end his life, that I thought was my father, is not and was not my biological father. And I am going to be honest with you, I haven't really dealt with that. It's been about a decade. I think I mentioned also a few videos ago last summer, we finally discovered who the actual person was. And when I reached out to what is a half sibling, they basically essentially rejected me and removed me from ancestry, and it's a whole thing. And so haven't really dealt with that, but it's like I've been living my whole life with this emptiness, and I'm just not sure how I want to deal with it. But apparently he's still alive. So that's a whole other saga that if I go into, I will definitely share. The point is, just like mothers and fathers, whatever, we have these wounds. And on days like Father's Day, we can find ourselves standing in the card aisle, not really knowing, I don't want to get this card because it says too much, or that card doesn't say enough, or whatever. I find that although these are Hallmark types of holidays, they bring up a wound that is always living inside of us. It just gets activated often on these kinds of holidays. So the bottom line is it matters. It matters in both caregivers in similar and different ways. When we talk about abandonment, what are we talking about? We're talking about, from a research perspective, and I'm going to link an article I found from 2023, talking about parental abandonment in terms of it being abuse, neglect, or rejection. And they looked at different populations and levels of harm. And obviously, one of the highest clinical populations are those who have been put in institutions or orphanages, who have been in foster care, physically removed. Because the truth is, if you've been physically removed, there is zero doubt that there has been emotional damage and mental damage and abuse. And so these people are going to have most likely the biggest experiences with those dynamics. But it doesn't mean if you don't have that level of parental abandonment that it is the only place that you will experience that you're not worthy of saying you have significant trauma or wounds. So, parental abandonment also includes clearly things like lack of care, lack of emotional attention, neglect, mental, physical, emotional neglect, a lack of supervision, of not being properly cared for or managed, left to your own devices. This is a big piece, I think, for Gen X, is that so many of us were left to our own devices, and many of us survived it, but in the process, a lot of really dangerous behavior and neglect occurred in our own worlds. Things like divorce, separation. A lot of parents will, maybe the father or mother was present and then they split, and now it's not necessarily a 50-50 situation, or the 50-50 is a bad situation. And so at one house it's good, the other house it's bad. Or there's intermittent or minimal custody. And so even in the best case scenarios, even if the father, let's say in that situation, in a classic heterosexual marriage, is a great dad, if he only gets his kids or wants them or sees them for whatever reason, twice a month, the kids are going to feel that. That's a shift. And I'm not suggesting that staying in a bad marriage at all is a good option. I personally think divorce is extremely damaging for most kids because I think it's a very rare percentage that co-parent well, that handle everything well, that integrate things well, that whole conscious uncoupling thing, which is great, except for your kids are still packing up their things, going back and forth. And yeah, in the best case scenario, that goes well and the parents are happier and all of that. But honestly, that is not as often the case as is a lot of other dynamics. And I don't have the answers for monogamy and marriage and divorce. I just want to say that it is impactful. And I think we don't talk about that enough because we often feel enough shame as it is in getting divorced. And it's hard to think about how much it hurts our kids at times. I'm not saying there aren't things that come out of it, resilience and strength and things like that. But I think we're fooling ourselves if we don't talk about that sometimes. But of course, that's a different video. So narcissistic abuse, mental illness by the parent. It could be ADHD, rage, impulsivity, bipolar, autism, undiagnosed, untreated, where the parent struggles with connection or with managing big feelings or who isolates, things like that. It could be a parent who gaslights and tells a 9-year-old child the ultimate, well, the phone goes both ways, which just, whenever I see those kind of posts, it's so triggering because I heard it in the 70s from my dad. You could pick up the phone. It's like, I'm 12, but okay. And you only visit me 5 times a year, but okay. And you don't live in town, but okay. And even though I love you so much and you're so much fun, you're going to flip out on my stepmother. Okay. Every single time I'm there. And by the way, when I come home from that, no one's going to ask me how to go. I'm going to be left to manage those feelings on my own, for example, right? So selfishness, I see a lot of, we're talking about because it's Father's Day, but it could be anybody, but it often is more, I'm just saying at this point, dads who have 10 hobbies and they play golf all day and they're gone all day. They work a lot. There's a selfishness. They don't know how to take care of the kids when mom isn't there. They think they are babysitting their kids. And so that's a problem. Or they have a wife or spouse who won't let them parent and they've let them not parent. And so that's a challenge. We'll talk about enabling the co-parent a little bit later. Obviously, things like mental illness left untreated, like I was saying. And the last thing I have here, and I kind of just said it, was enabling another bad parent. So the mother is like a raging narcissist and she screams and yells, or other disorders. And the father just slowly fades into the background. He doesn't protect his kids. And I will say that dynamic, when you have one like that, is one of the hardest ones to unpack in therapy, because in comparison to the bad mother, dad is the good one. But then we have to dive into, okay, but why did he stand back and let all those things happen to you? And I understand generationally and things like that it has been difficult for men in different ways. And so I'm not suggesting that it's easy, but we know so much more now. So what does it do to us? Like I'm saying, the first thing is abandonment can affect the brain. And there are lots of studies about everything from, like I'm saying, the institutionalized foster care orphanage dynamic all the way down. But the bottom line is that it impacts how to deal with relationships in the brain, how we understand reciprocity, how we understand social interactions and our role in them. how the brain is pruning and shaping and understanding those things. And in fact, in one study called the Bucharest study, it talks about that, for example, these are looking at Romanian orphanages, so the highest clinical dynamic, but these kids had reduced brain activity along with decreased gray and white matter and executive function and high rates of behavioral and emotional problems. Now, on the other hand, it showed that some of these things could be reversed if the kids were potentially adopted younger. But I will say that, these early years are significant. And so there is some mixed research about that. But I don't want to paint the worst picture. The truth is safe, loving, continuous, reliable parenting goes a long way. But you can't underestimate that. The second thing is it gives us attachment wounds. And so we know, again, from things like the orphanage studies that are talked about in many places, where even with attachment, the kids who were put in orphanages, who were in, let's say, decently loving families, but the parent could no longer handle them, versus the kids who were in really damaging, early situations, that the children who survived the abuse that occurred in the orphanages, unfortunately, at the hands of often religious dynamics, that the kids who fared better in life later, the adults who did better after those experiences, were the ones who came into the orphanage having a little bit better attachment. They had some secure attachment, even in spite of their abandonment, versus the ones who came in already bad situations, then had abuse, and then tried to manage life. Number 3, we see a lot of self-esteem issues, and then separate but related, the idea of chronic guilt and shame. And the article I'm linking down below talks about the differences between guilt and shame and how that is impacted depending upon the environment, from parental rejection to neglect and things like that. And don't forget that the core of this is that a shame parenting, a shame-based parenting is like, why'd you do that? What's wrong with you? You're so stupid, whatever. It's you are. And the guilt dynamic is more about what you did, the choices you made. And one of the things it said in that article was that regardless of that one of the threads, which I talk about so much, is that the thread is all I know for whatever is happening is that I am the child. I am the reason why this happened to me. That is that internalized blame we put on ourselves. And I think one of the hardest pieces to deal with in therapy, but in a really important one, separating ourselves from how we were labeled or the way we blamed ourselves to survive, from the environment we were placed in, from our parents' own mental health struggles, things like that. Number 4, chronic illness. We know from the ACEs studies that the more childhood maltreatment we have in any form, rejection, abandonment, neglect, that we are more likely to struggle with lifelong chronic illnesses, cancer, diabetes, autoimmune disease, PCOS, fibromyalgia, maternal mental health issues, traumatic brain injury, all kinds of things. So ongoing dynamics there. The next one, number 5, is the relational reenactment we often find ourselves in these situations. So a lot of attachment dynamics playing out, right? We're trying to heal those childhoods, but because of that abandonment, mental, physical, or emotional, we can find ourselves, or all of the above, so desperately wanting a different partner, but then ending up choosing a partner who look different, but where we feel a lot of the same things: alone, rejected, neglected, and use a lot of the same strategies like anxiety, self-blame, isolation, things like that. The next place it affects us is significantly in our identity. Who am I? Am I the bad child? What do I pursue? Depending upon the environment, pursue meaning like hobbies and dreams and hopes and goals. Not everyone is born having it's very rare, I think, to be a child and just know you want to be something. But who am I at my core, even separate from what I do, can be a big part of this trauma. Number 7 is a lot of self-medicating, numbing, dissociating, isolating, things like that as coping mechanisms, only feeling safe in your body when you are somehow not fully there, when you are alone, things like that. And then lastly, a lot of mood dysregulation that I think often comes from witnessing what may have been a lot of dysregulation at home. Parents who made you walk on eggshells, who shut you out with a silent treatment, things like that. But the core is being highly sensitive in that hypervigilant way to scanning, but also to rejection. And that is one of the core features of BPD, for example, that borderline dynamic, where we're just always afraid that we will be left. And so that really drives and can drive a lot of our dysregulation, for example. So Now we're at what can you do about it? This is really important. And we're going to talk in the second part of this, if you are a father, what else you can do to ideally enhance the role and the value and the impact of who you are upon the lives of your children. But for the first part, let's just say you have a parental abandonment wound. What can you do? The first thing is to understand, obviously, to just accept that that is the reality, that even though you wish you didn't or long for it or fantasize about it, that you do, and to stop neglecting yourself. And so a lot of the ways I believe this gets acted out is like I've talked about, ignoring medical appointments, devaluing ourselves, not prioritizing our physical, mental health care, our dental care, our mammograms, our checkups, our cholesterol, exercise, our diet, like a lot of just like, I'm not worthy or I don't know how to do that, right? And I've been talking a lot about neurodivergence. I'm going to keep talking about that. But also, that might be overwhelming. Making phone calls, setting appointments, identifying and verbalizing and communicating what you suspect is wrong. And then often being gaslit by the medical community on all kinds of things around our physical and mental health care. So that's a big one. But start to look at your life and ask yourself, where do I need to like step it up in terms of taking care of myself? And just pick one goal, like one thing a month, right, to start to work on. I'm going to make my medical appointments on Monday. I'm going to make myself do it. And then next Monday, I'll work on something else, like looking at how I could modify my diet, whatever it is, whatever makes you feel better. But understanding that often the deeply held root, in addition to the just difficulty of making those things happen, like I just said, is not believing you're worthy of it. Number two, working on your identity development. It's a huge piece of this. And so writing out, you can Google these exercises. There's so many online. Who am I? What do I care about? What do I love? What do I hate? What do I need to think about more? What are my dreams? What are my goals? Make a vision board. It sounds like stupid, but it really can help you start to identify and like write out I am and write out who you are, for example. I have that in my new course. I love this exercise in my new course. It's about, we do a whole thing on identity, and then the exercise is about looking at who you are in the past and who you are now. It's just really beautiful. The next one is start to identify your non-negotiables in relationships around boundaries, right? So what will you accept? What will you not accept? What is working for you? What is not? Where is a place you need to start saying, I matter, even though I feel like I don't matter? And so I'm going to stop letting you, take this thing from me, borrow this thing from me, take up all my time, talk to me this way, treat me this way. It's little steps, baby steps. The next one is recognize that you are often reenacting the wound of your adult abandonment in your marriage, in your divorce, in your friendships, and work to accept it. So you might not recognize that what's happening, that you are in a situation of reenactment. I have so many clients historically who are in terrible marriages and they have no intention of going anywhere and they are miserable. And yet there's just not ever going to be, for all kinds of reasons, the ability to leave. And they get stuck in, well, why is he like that? Why is she like that? And if you're not going to leave, you have to start to figure out how to build a life for yourself inside of that relationship. This, of course, implies that they don't want to go to therapy. They don't want to work on it. And ideally, you're not in a physically dangerous situation, but you don't realize that physically dangerous in your mind is like, oh, I would leave if they were, using again. I would leave if they put their hands on me. But you don't realize that you are simmering in a pot of emotional abuse every single day. And it's not your fault. But at some point, whatever it is, and getting out can be incredibly difficult. And so that's not easy either. But to start to look at little ways to identify what's happening and start to accept it and start to build identity. Like maybe you can't leave now financially, but they will support you going back to school. Go back to school, start to do things, or get a little job that becomes a bigger job. There are little ways, but I don't want to minimize how hard it is. And the reality is the consequences, especially for women, are often significant in terms of childcare and work. So my point is, though, like people are just stuck in that and they just have to start to accept it and figure out what little things or big things they can and want to do. But they're often like this in denial about it. Number 5 is have self-compassion. Please engage in practices that help you honor that it wasn't your fault in childhood and that there are little ways you can, have love for yourself. As I always say a million times, it's not just about putting a sticky note and looking in the mirror. That's fine, but it is about doing things, building an identity, getting a little part-time job, pursuing a hobby, setting boundaries. I really truly believe that. Feeding yourself a good meal after you had something that you thought, that wasn't so great. Learning a new skill, whatever it is. Now, let's get to what to do if you are a father today, since it is Father's Day. This might sound a little bit harsh, but it is the truth. It has been my truth, at least experience. And I want to say that as a result of having 3 sons who are now all adults, and frankly, working with men in therapy has been the greatest gift of my life in trying to understand men in ways I just could not. And I've said it in a few videos. I was afraid of working with men. I was afraid for my physical safety of being in my office alone with them. And that was based on experiences. I did have an experience in college where it was an attempted kidnapping by 3, this is such a random video, by 3 guys. And I was with my boyfriend and he went in the door and forgot to wait for me to go in. And this guy grabbed me and started pulling me into the street. And he had friends in the car they were trying to get me into. And my boyfriend at the time, I started screaming and he came out the door. The guy ran and he was caught, and he had some kind of weird starter gun or gun in his pocket. Anyway, and I was afraid to press charges. It was a whole thing. The point is that experience made me afraid of men for a lot of years, not to mention my terror at the trauma that happens to women and girls every single day on this planet. And I don't think oftentimes men realize that we live with that fear in every single moment. And so the point is, I had a skewed experience, and I've also had a lot of really lovely, beautiful experiences in working with men. And this is what I've learned. A lot of them don't know how to be dads because they weren't fathered, right? And so they're looking to their wives or their co-partners if you're in a gay relationship or other kind of relationship, and they're trying to figure it out. But a lot of these men have father wounds and don't know it. So the dad was in the house but was emotionally unavailable. The dad was stoic or critical or condescending or abusive. Or the dad left and there was no dad. And so they're trying to figure it out. And I do think that millennial fathers are approaching fathering in a different way with more information. But ask yourself things like, what are you doing to be a better partner to your spouse, married, divorced, or not? Are you expecting her, for today, to plan Father's Day, but you don't plan Mother's Day, her birthday, buy Christmas presents, buy flowers? You don't model her value? Are you the kind of father that you feel like you babysit your kids and that you don't know what to do with bottles and diaper bags, and she can't go on a girls' trip or a family trip or a work trip because she has to line everything up for you because you don't know how to do it? Do you spend too much time on hobbies or work? Do you tell yourself that, it's quality time, not quantity, when actually it is both? Do you spend all day on the golf course, for example, and that's 7 hours, and now she gets to go out for 2 hours and she's actually going to the grocery store alone? That is not giving her a break, for example. Do you respect and model love to your children's mother? If you're doing all these things, chef's kiss, amazing. And I think a lot of dads really are now. But the point is, historically, these are things that are still very much embedded into our society around fathering. Is what can you do to be a better father? This is true for anybody in a parenting role, but number 1, try to be present more often. Set boundaries when you can about work. I understand. I have been the primary breadwinner. I have been the full-time parent. I have been a stay-at-home mom. And I understand the weight of that. It is one reason why you see me working so hard here, because I really am on my own. And the pressure of providing for my kids in college, it is overwhelming. But I just don't want you to hear that that you have work pressure. I get it. It is a tremendous burden. And the more you earn, the more you spend. I get that. But your job, if you see yourself as only working when you go to work and you come home when you're off, your spouse who's home with the kids, or in most cases now, most spouses and partners are both working, is that in traditional heterosexual relationships, she's still working long after you come home. her job is 24/7. And I really believe that at least the men who are 40-ish and up don't fully understand that. And I know I work in a more affluent community, and so it's almost even worse, this idea that, well, I go to work and do the paycheck and you do everything else. And I'm telling you that that is not a great way to have a great marriage. It's not great modeling for your kids, and it's not the way parenting is going. Your sons and daughters and children, whoever they are going to be expected to do a lot more. And so trying to stay active and engaged is important. I get it. You can't go to everything. You have to travel. You have work events sometimes. No one's saying that. But, trying to be more hands-on and being a full, competent parent if your spouse was tomorrow, and believing that you would be okay, at least in terms of how you caregive your child, is a true sign. So be curious, ask them questions, be emotionally available, be, willing to learn things, be willing to teach things. All the men I work with who have father wounds will tell you that they don't know how to do things like they had to teach themselves off of YouTube how to change a battery in a car, how to file for insurance. Like, this is not just true for men, but there are certain things that, we need to teach everyone, but that often get neglected. And so you are being expected, if you are a father, or maybe you're the mother version of the father, you're the primary caretaker, doesn't matter. They need all those things from you, not just nurturing and love, but they need to be taught. Being open and active and engaged. Number 2, not enabling the other parent who's not great. Now, I know if you're divorced, it's much harder. I could make a whole video on that dynamic. What do you do when you have to legally send your kids to a situation that you don't feel good about? I could talk about that forever, but the point is that, especially in your home, to work on not enabling bad behavior when your spouse yells and screams, when your spouse calls names, to pull them aside quietly when things are settled and have conversations and hold them accountable to changing those behaviors, things like that. Number 3, like I said, teach, learn, be open. Understand that parenting is an evolution and we're all going to be imperfect and screw it up. I mean, all of us. And sometimes things happen that are beyond our control, but be curious. Like I said, if your child is questioning their identity, I believe that it is not helpful for you. Even if you, for whatever reason, don't agree with that, this is your child. They need you. They need you to try to understand them. Your love and understanding means everything. And this isn't 1950 anymore, 1930. And so it matters how you accept your child and their stages of curiosity and their mistakes. And I think too often we say, oh, that's mother's work in heterosexual relationships. So I just believe it's important. Number 4, respect your other parent. Stop criticizing, condescending, minimizing them in front of your kids, not just in front of your kids, but in general. But if you really want to teach your kids about these things, we all know we lose it and say things we regret. But like even that, to say, hey, in front of the other parent, I'm really sorry I said that to you, and I apologize, and I will work harder on not saying that. To model that in front of your children is so powerful. Number 5, try to be affectionate, be safe, be reliable, be generally consistent in who you are. If you struggle with that because of substance abuse or mental illness, there's nothing wrong with that, but just go get help. Go do the work. Be open, be reliable, be a safe containment space. And lastly, the research shows that one of the roles that fathers can do is that they can, like I said kind of in the beginning, hold safe, healthy boundaries. That energy where they can bring something different, that ideally is the role of 2 parents or more, is that we all have something different to offer. Maybe your wife is the one that holds those and you're the softie. That's okay. Then be the softie, right? But figure that out in a way that creates some kind of like containment, balance, and also a place for exploration for your kids. So that's it. This video was so much longer than I wanted, but I really think it's important. And so I wanted to share those things with you. The last thing I'll say is if you follow me here, I'm please, I am working on a book deal, hopefully. And I have neglected my Instagram account like so much because historically I did not like Instagram because it made me feel bad about myself. But it turns out that for the publishing world, having your Instagram account be a healthy one is important. And I've done great on TikTok. I've done great here. I've worked really hard. I just started posting more on Instagram. And so I've kind of struggled to find my identity there, but I would love for you to please follow me there if you're willing. It's free. Please, if you're on IG. I've been reposting, but I've also been posting original content there in posts that I don't post anywhere else around neurodivergence and family trauma, eggshell relationships, mother wounds, enmeshment, parentification. And today I was just waking up for like hours. I really need a strategy there. And so I think what I'm going to do, as I've mentioned, I am going to build a newsletter soon for many of you, but I'm going to start to post, I think specifically on Instagram, content that is about trauma and neurodivergence. So autism, ADHD, trauma, CPTSD, all the things I talk about here, but I really want to focus it on skills and tools, reminders, and knowledge and resources. So that is something I think I'm only going to post, that kind of content. I know some of the feedback has been, well, what do we do about all these things? And that's hard because I think people want a quick answer in a video, but at the same time, even if it's just a reminder, set boundaries today, or go in a blue and green environment, and these are some skills you can do for your nervous system, things like that. So that's my goal. So I promise you I will work on that, and I would love for you to follow me there if you haven't done so already. And then of course on TikTok, it's probably more like all over the place, but it's all the same things I talk about on this channel, just in different ways. So thank you so much for being here. I truly appreciate you. I know that today, for so many years, like I said in the beginning, can be just a painful day in all kinds of ways. And so I'm sending you love and well-being. And I hope that you will do one thing today that really honors that you matter and that you are valuable and worthy. So I'll see you soon. Take care.